I joined the British Army back in '96, and fairly shortly after coming out of officer training at Sandhurst, I was sent to the Balkans. A slightly unusual mission out there. We were unarmed, and it was our role to collect information to verify what was happening on the ground. On the face of it, things were going well. I got awarded an award for being Best Young Officer. I captained my country on the sports field, but behind closed doors, the wheels were coming off, and I was living off vodka, Valium, sleeping pills, antidepressants, anything really just to numb the pain. The flashbacks, nightmares started fairly quickly, actually. It felt very much like the kind of military brotherhood, like I had a contagious disease. I felt cast out, ostracised, and very, very quickly unravelled. A few years later, I left the army, still not diagnosed. And then it wasn't until 2007, so we're now talking nearly 10 years later, where I had a breakdown and I was hospitalised and started a very intensive therapy programme. Now that was all in all 20 years ago, and the last few years I've felt ready to start sharing my story. And if I can help break down a few of those barriers and some of that stigma to get people just to talk, I think, if you can catch it early in the first 6 months, then hopefully there'll be people that won't end up with such complex issues and deeply entrenched mental illness that I have had to deal with.
In those years between when you left the forces and when you were hospitalised in 2007, did anybody approach you? Why wasn't it caught early for you?
I think the reason it wasn't caught early was because, back then people didn't really talk PTSD, didn't really know what it meant. It was before Iraq and Afghanistan. People were frightened of it. My behaviours were increasingly dysfunctional. I wasn't easy to be around. I was not just angry, I was raging, I was drinking, and it wasn't easy to approach me the more entrenched it became, really. And I didn't know where to go. GPs really, again, they didn't know what to do with a veteran. Once I was out of the military, there was in the UK, there's no government support. Once you're a veteran and you're on your own. So I didn't know where to go. The social setting, the relational setting, your family, it all takes its toll, and it can be absolutely devastating with family breakdown, relationship breakdown, isolation, and that's how it becomes far more complex, and that was why I ended up in hospital with it.
What did that do to your relationships with your family and friends?
I lost many friends. Relationships with my family broke down, and I still haven't regained those relationships. I think if you speak to many veterans or first responders, anybody, civilians with post-traumatic stress, the reality is that there's huge loss and grief with it outside of the trauma itself, and that damage stays. I haven't regained that. It's not fixed. People often talk about going back to the person you were. I'm not, and I never will be, but I'm getting there with being proud about the person that I am now and moving forward with that hope.
PTSD is not really something that discriminates.
Yeah, PTSD can affect anybody. You don't have to have been a military veteran. First responder, it can affect anybody. It's a normal response to an abnormal event. One of the reasons that I'm here in Australia is for the international scene. I think, my hope is that internationally we can collectively learn from each other, whether that's research, awareness, best practice for treatment, because it doesn't discriminate across international borders. And I think also generational impact. There's young, there's middle-aged, there's old. It doesn't discriminate. We may have called it shell shock back then, or we may have called it something different, and the treatments may be more advanced, our knowledge may be more advanced, but it doesn't discriminate.
What was that moment like when you actually went, aha, there's something going on here and I can actually name it now?
There was this overwhelming sense of relief. For almost 10 years I'd lived with this guilt and shame that it was me and I wasn't good enough and I didn't quite stack up. And so to have somebody share, it's okay, was, you're ill, it's okay, it's not your fault. There was a huge sense of relief. Then there was frustration coming up against a lack of awareness and understanding from my social circle as to what that meant. If I'd broken my leg, then people would understand why you're on a pair of crutches. But there was a certain level of cynicism, fear, lack of understanding as to what it was. I think one of the biggest things that helped me was I went into a charity called Combat Stress, and there was this huge warrant officer, massive guy, bald, typical kind of Academy Sergeant Major type figure. And I was sat terrified actually in reception thinking, Lordy, why am I here? And he came up to me, gave me a brew and just said, it's all right now. It's all right. We're all in this together. And that for me, for the first time in 10 years, I felt like I belonged again. And to describe the sense of betrayal and anger and rage when you feel cast out from the military group, from the military family, to then have this huge beast of a man who was in there too as a patient, putting his arms around me and saying, it's all right, it's okay, you can chat about it here, we're all in this together, was just overwhelming. And the relief is something that I will always remember, because it's heartbreaking when you don't feel that you belong anymore in a military family that you've worked so hard to be a part of. I don't even know his name, but he is a very special guy.
Tell me what you hope to achieve by having these public conversations, by bringing people from all over to talk about this issue.
When I went to the Invictus Games in 2016, it was one of the most inspirational events I have ever been to. And I think the word, for me, that summarises it is hope. My view is that without hope, there's no recovery. And when you experience the Invictus Games and see the resilience and the journeys that the wounded, injured, sick veterans are on, it is quite remarkable.
Yeah, Gemma Morgan there speaking and sharing her story with Matt Bedford. And thank you, Gemma, too, because it's no mean feat to share your story publicly, and whether it be on radio interviews or television stories. And you could hear the emotion in her voice there. So thank you very much.